He told her she wasn't fit to be a wife. But when London's elite gathered to watch her fall, the cold Duke did something no one expected. He kissed her hand in front of them all. Like, subscribe, and step into a world where whispers become love stories. London, 1845. The winter fog curled like pale fingers around the wrought iron gates of Harrington House, wrapping the grand estate in a shroud of secrecy. Inside, the great drawing room buzzed with anxious whispers. Servants moved like shadows, lighting oil lamps that cast golden pools of light upon velvet drapes and carved mahogany furniture. At the center of it all stood Miss Amara Duval, spine straight as a sword, chin lifted, heart hammering like a wild drum. She wore a gown of deep plum silk, modest, outdated by London standards, but carefully mended to perfection. Her natural curls were elegantly pinned beneath a modest bonnet, her dark skin glowing softly under the lamplight. At 31, Amara was neither a debutante nor a society beauty. She was the quiet scandal, the unmarried daughter of a deceased diplomat, well-educated yet unwanted by London's high-born suitors. Tonight, that was about to change, or so her aunt insisted. "Stand still, child," hissed Lady Beatrice, her sharp eyes scanning Amara's attire as though sheer will could transform plum silk into Parisian couture. "The Duke of Ashbourne will arrive any moment. You must remember your place. Speak little, smile only when necessary, and for heaven's sake, do not argue with him." "I do not argue," Amara replied calmly. "I reason." Her aunt's fan snapped shut. Exactly the sort of thing that makes men flee. The sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones silenced the room. A butler entered, announcing in his low, practiced voice, "His Grace, the Duke of Ashbourne." The doors swung open, and Duke Nathaniel Ashbourne strode in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed with impeccable precision: dark tailcoat, ivory cravat, boots polished to a mirror shine. His presence filled the room like a thundercloud. His gaze, cold and assessing, swept over the assembled guests before landing on Amara. For a moment, the world narrowed to the silent clash of two eyes. His a cool gray like a storm about to break; hers, warm and unflinching. Nathaniel inclined his head slightly, out of duty rather than courtesy. "Miss Duval," he said, his baritone smooth but distant. "Your Grace," she replied with equal poise, curtsying just low enough to meet propriety, not deference. Their introduction was followed by the ritual small talk of the upper-class weather, estates, the season, but beneath each polite phrase, unspoken tensions coiled like serpents. Nathaniel had no interest in marriage. Society whispered that he needed an heir, but his heart had long been barricaded by loss and duty. Amara, meanwhile, had no illusions. She knew she was here not as a choice, but as a solution. "Miss Duval," the Duke said after a pause, his gaze unwavering, "I have been told you are suitable." Her brow arched slightly. "Suitable for the arrangement," he clarified, voice clipped. "You are of respectable family, and though lacking certain accomplishments, you appear educated." Lady Beatrice's face turned a shade paler than the pearls at her neck. Amara, however, merely tilted her head, a slow smile touching her lips, not a warm smile, but one of quiet defiance. "I assure you, Your Grace," she said softly, "I am quite accomplished at existing without your approval." A shocked silence fell. A footman choked back a cough. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. He was not accustomed to being challenged, least of all by a woman who stood outside the glittering mold of London's fragile belles. Then, as if testing a horse's temperament, he uttered the words that would define the beginning of their story. "You are not fit to be a wife." The room froze. Lady Beatrice gasped audibly, but Amara only inclined her head slowly, her gaze steady as tempered steel. "Then it is fortunate," she replied, "that I did not come here to beg for the role." In that moment, something flickered in his eyes, something he quickly smothered beneath layers of practiced coldness. He turned sharply, signaling the end of their conversation. But the duel had been drawn. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows. Inside, the first move of a dangerous dance had begun. Amara Duval might have been unwanted by London's gossips, but she had no intention of being dismissed by the Duke. And Nathaniel Ashbourne, who had spent years mastering control, found his perfectly ordered world tilt ever so slightly because of one woman who refused to bow. The morning after the Duke's biting remark, London society was already stirring with whispers. Drawing rooms across Mayfair hummed with the latest tidbit. "The Duke of Ashbourne met Miss Amara Duval last night." Quite the scene, they say. Quite the scene. Amara sat in the library of her aunt's townhouse, sunlight filtering weakly through frosted glass. Her fingers traced the worn spine of a book she wasn't reading. She'd grown up among diplomats, had crossed oceans, had dined with foreign kings, and yet nothing had prepared her for the chill of Nathaniel Ashbourne's disdain. Lady Beatrice swept into the room like a gust of perfume and silk. "Amara, he's here." Amara looked up slowly. "Vous." Her aunt fanned herself dramatically. "The Duke, of course. He's come unannounced, which can only mean one thing. Oh heavens, child, fix your hair." Before she could protest, a footman announced the Duke's presence. Nathaniel entered, every inch the aristocrat, his expression carved from stone. His gray eyes met hers with that same unreadable intensity. "Miss Duval," he said with a curt nod. "Your Grace," she replied, rising with measured grace. Lady Beatrice fluttered toward the door. "I shall leave you too," she said, though her face betrayed the agony of missing gossip firsthand. The door closed behind her, and silence filled the room. Nathaniel moved to stand near the window, his back half turned to her. "I will speak plainly," he began. "My advisors, my solicitor, and certain family pressures have made it clear that I must marry before the season ends. It is not a matter of sentiment. It is necessity." Amara folded her hands before her, masking the irritation rising in her chest. "And what has this to do with me, Your Grace?" "You are unmarried," he said flatly, "of acceptable lineage, educated," and his gaze flicked toward her, briefly unlikely to harbor delusions about romance. "I require a duchess, not a dreamer." The words were clinical, like a business transaction. Amara's lips curved not into a smile, but something sharper. "You make matrimony sound like hiring a butler." His jaw tightened. "I do not dress my intentions in poetry, Miss Duval. My late father made the mistake of marrying for love. The cost of that sentimentality was borne by the entire estate. I will not repeat it." She stepped closer, enough that the golden light caught the planes of his face. "And if I refuse?" His gaze locked onto hers, steady and unflinching. "Then I shall find another. But understand this. Your aunt's finances are delicate. A match with me would secure her household, and yours." It was a calculated strike. He expected outrage, or perhaps tears. Instead, Amara simply tilted her head, considering him the way one might consider a complicated chess move. "You insulted me last night," she said evenly. "You declared I was unfit to be a wife, and now you return with a proposal?" He did not flinch. "I speak the truth as I see it. You are not the sort of woman society would expect at my side, but society will adjust. They always do." For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The air between them tightened, charged. Amara saw more than a cold duke. She saw a man barricaded behind rules and expectations so tightly that he could barely breathe. "And what do you offer in return, Your Grace?" she asked finally. "Beyond a title and a gilded cage." His brow furrowed. "Protection, security, influence. A life free from scandal or want." Many women would seize such an offer without question. She smiled faintly. "I am not many women." Something flickered in his eyes again, frustration, admiration, or both. "No," he said softly, almost to himself. "You are not." Then, as if making peace with his own discomfort, he turned fully toward her. "Miss Duval, I am offering marriage, a formal union. I will not promise love. I will promise respect, honesty, and a duchess's place in society. Do you accept?" Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She could see the path laid out. A marriage of convenience, a life in grand halls where whispers followed her every step. But she also saw the alternative. Financial ruin for her aunt, social exile for herself. She inhaled slowly. "I accept, on one condition." His brows rose. "Which is?" "That you never attempt to tame me," she said. "I will be your duchess, but I will not be your shadow." A long silence. Then, to her surprise, the corner of his mouth twitched the ghost of a smile. "Very well," he said. "I prefer honesty." And just like that, with no kneeling, no flowers, no declarations, the engagement between Amara Duval and Nathaniel, Duke of Ashbourne, was sealed like a political treaty. Outside, church bells tolled in the distance. Inside, Two people stood beneath the filtered winter light, neither realizing that their careful arrangement would become something far more dangerous than either intended. 3 weeks later, the great gates of Ashbourne Hall groaned open, and Amara's carriage rolled onto the long gravel drive. A biting wind swept across the sprawling grounds, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the faint smoke of distant chimneys. The mansion itself loomed in the gray light, a fortress of stone and shadow, majestic, but cold. Amara sat with her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. Her new life as Duchess of Ashbourne had begun, though it hardly felt like hers. Since their marriage performed quietly at St. James's Chapel with only a handful of witnesses, Nathaniel had been unfailingly courteous, but distant. No tender word, no lingering glance. To the world, she was his Duchess. To him, she was a contract fulfilled. The carriage came to a halt before the grand entrance. Footmen hurried forward, their livery immaculate, their faces impassive. One opened the door, bowing low. "Your Grace." Amara stepped down, the hem of her traveling gown brushing against the damp gravel. Her gaze lifted to the towering facade, the windows like watchful eyes. She inhaled deeply, schooling her features into composure. Nathaniel was already there, dismounting his black stallion with practiced ease. He looked every inch, the Duke dark coat buttoned to the throat, boots gleaming, expression unreadable. Without a word, he offered his arm. Amara placed her hand lightly on it, the gesture formal, almost ceremonial. Together they ascended the marble steps into the echoing hall. The interior was grander still, vaulted ceilings painted with faded frescoes, chandeliers dripping with crystal, portraits of solemn ancestors staring down from gilded frames. Yet despite the splendor, a chill pervaded the air. Ashbourne Hall was not a home, it was a monument to power. Carved in stone, a woman in severe black silk appeared at the top of the stairs. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying. "Welcome to Ashbourne. I am Mrs. Talbot, the housekeeper. If you will allow me, I shall show the Duchess to her apartments." Nathaniel inclined his head. "See to it." Then, turning to Amara, he added, "I am expected in my study. We dine at 8. Punctuality is essential." And with that he strode away, his footsteps echoing until the doors closed behind him. Amara followed Mrs. Talbot through an endless maze of corridors, each more lavish than the last. Tapestries, gilt mirrors, marble busts, all carefully displayed, yet strangely lifeless. At last they arrived at a suite of rooms in the east wing. "These are yours, Your Grace," Mrs. Talbot said. Her voice clipped, as though reciting lines rehearsed 100 times. "The Duke's apartments are in the west wing. A maid will attend you shortly." Amara nodded, stepping inside. The chambers were vast, with silk-draped windows, a carved four-poster bed, and a fire already lit in the hearth. Yet as she stood in the silence, she felt the weight of separation settle over her. Separate wings, separate lives. So this was marriage. That evening, Amara dressed carefully for dinner in a gown of midnight blue satin. Martha, her faithful maid from London, fussed over her hair, arranging delicate pearl pins among her curls. "You look every inch the Duchess, my lady," Martha said softly. "He cannot ignore you forever." Amara forced a smile. "Wie shall sie?" At precisely 8, she entered the dining hall. The room was vast enough to hold 50 guests, yet only 2 places were set at the long mahogany table. Nathaniel was already seated at the far end, a decanter of claret before him. He rose politely as she approached, waiting until she had been seated before taking his place again. The first course was served in silence. Silver cutlery gleamed, candles flickered, and the only sound was the faint clink of glass against porcelain. Nathaniel ate with the precision of a man fulfilling an obligation, his expression neutral, his eyes seldom lifting from his plate. At last, Amara set down her fork. Does conversation not accompany meals at Ashbourne Hall? His gray eyes lifted, cool and assessing. "If you wish to converse, by all means." "I did not wish to tire you with trivialities." "Sometimes," she said quietly, "it is the trivialities that prevent us from drowning in silence." A flicker of something surprise perhaps crossed his face. Then it was gone. "Very well," he said, after a pause. "How do you find Ashbourne?" "Cold," she answered honestly. "Magnificent, yes, but cold." His lips curved faintly, though not in amusement. That is an apt description. And so the evening passed measured words across an ocean of distance. When at last they parted in the grand hallway, he merely inclined his head. "Good night, Your Grace." Alone in her chambers, Amara stood by the window, gazing out at the moonlit grounds. Somewhere in the west wing, her husband slept or perhaps paced, as she had seen him do. Restless and haunted, she pressed her palm to the glass, the chill seeping through her skin. She was not broken. She would not be silent. If the Duke of Ashbourne thought her unfit to be a wife, then she would show him what it meant to be far more than that. And in the quiet of the night, the first seeds of defiance and perhaps something deeper were sown. The weeks that followed were marked by a rigid routine. Mornings were consumed by correspondence and lessons in estate affairs, afternoons with obligatory visits to neighboring families, and evenings by those silent frostbitten dinners that had become their peculiar ritual. To the staff, Amara was a curiosity. She carried herself with dignity, but her skin, her accent, her wit, they all whispered of difference. Servants eyed her with cautious respect, some with genuine warmth, others with the quiet skepticism that centuries of unchallenged hierarchy had etched into their bones. And Nathaniel, he remained a fortress, present, polite, unreachable. But every fortress has a crack. It began on a rain-heavy afternoon. Amara wandered the eastern gardens, their hedges wild with neglect. Autumn had stripped most of the roses bare, but here and there, a stubborn bloom clung to life. Her fingers brushed one such flower, its petals bruised but unbowed. "Most consider this part of the estate forgotten," came a voice behind her. She turned to find Nathaniel standing a few feet away, his greatcoat dark with rain, hair damp from riding. He must have returned early from some errand. "Forgotten places often hold the most beauty," she replied softly. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked, not as the Duke surveying his Duchess, but as a man surprised by something unexpected. "You have a talent for seeing what others ignore," he said at last. "And you," she countered, "have a talent for ignoring what others might see." His brow furrowed. "Is that a criticism?" "An observation," she answered with a faint smile. For once, he did not retreat behind formality. Instead, he stepped closer, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. "This garden was my mother's," he said quietly. "She tended it herself. After she died, my father had the gardeners abandon it. He said beauty had no place in a house built for survival." Her gaze softened. "And you agreed with him?" "I didn't disagree." His eyes shifted to the roses. "I was 14. My father's word was law. I learned that emotions were liabilities. Gardens. Love. All of it." Amara's heart tightened. For the first time, the Duke of Ashbourne wasn't a silhouette of authority, he was a boy who had once watched his world unravel. "You mistake feeling for weakness," she said gently. "But a garden doesn't make a house weak. It makes it alive." He didn't reply. Rain pattered against the leaves, a soft rhythm that filled the silence between them. When he finally turned to leave, his voice was low. "You speak as if the world is kind enough to allow such things. And you live as if it never will be," she murmured when he was gone. That night, a second crack appeared. Amara couldn't sleep. Wandering through the dim corridors, she found herself before the library doors. They were slightly ajar. Inside, a fire glowed low, casting flickering light across shelves of leather-bound volumes. Nathaniel was there, alone, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair slightly disheveled. He wasn't reading. He was pacing, a letter crushed in his hand. She almost turned away, but he looked up. "You're awake," he said, surprise softening his usually measured tone. "As are you," she replied, stepping inside. "I didn't realize dukes had restless nights." He gave a dry, humorless laugh. "Some letters are best read when the house sleeps." "Bad news?" His jaw worked as if deciding whether to trust her. "A cousin, demanding his share of the estate's revenue. He believes I'm mismanaging my inheritance by marrying outside the expected circles." Her stomach tightened. "Because of me, because of their prejudice." He corrected firmly, almost sharply. "You are not the cause. You are their excuse." The words were unexpected. Warmth flickered in her chest. "You defend me then?" "I defend my decisions," he said quickly, but his eyes held hers a heartbeat too long. She moved closer to the fire, the orange light catching the pearl pins in her hair. Your decisions include me, Your Grace. That makes them personal. For a fleeting moment his guarded expression faltered. Amara, he said, her name slipping out like something both unfamiliar and dangerous. She froze. He had never spoken her name like that before, without title, without armor. The air between them changed, thickened. Neither moved closer, but the space seemed suddenly fragile, like spun glass. Then, as if realizing he'd stepped too near the edge, he looked away. You should rest, he said, voice cool again. She nodded slowly and left, though her pulse thrummed wildly. Behind her, in the quiet library, Nathaniel stared into the fire long after she was gone. The next morning, the household buzzed with preparations for the upcoming Ashbourne autumn ball, the first since their marriage. Invitations had been sent to every notable family within 100 miles. It would be the night society judged their union. As Amara watched the maids unpack shimmering gowns and polish silver, she caught Nathaniel's gaze across the hall. He was giving orders to his steward, face composed as ever. Yet when their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them, something neither could quite name. The fortress was cracking. And through those cracks, the first rays of something dangerous and beautiful were beginning to slip in. The night of the Ashbourne autumn ball arrived like a storm cloaked in silk. Carriages lined the long gravel drive, their lanterns glowing through the mist. From every corner of London and beyond, nobles and gossips descended upon Ashbourne Hall like crows drawn to glittering spoils. Inside, the grand ballroom shimmered with hundreds of candles. Chandeliers threw cascades of light over polished floors, and a string quartet filled the air with a waltz that curled like warm smoke. Servants bustled discreetly, trays of champagne gliding through the crowd. Amara stood at the top of the staircase, her breath catching for the briefest moment. She wore a gown of gold silk that hugged her frame with quiet regality, the neckline modest but the presence undeniable. A delicate tiara, one of the late Duchess's pieces, rested against her curls. She had never looked more like a duchess, nor felt more like a target. Below, whispers fluttered like restless wings. That's her, the new Duchess. She's older than I imagined, and of course, different. The Duke must be desperate. She had expected it. She had trained herself to meet their gazes without flinching. But what she hadn't expected was the way Nathaniel's eyes lifted when he saw her. The Duke of Ashbourne paused mid-conversation, his usually controlled expression faltering for just a breath. His gaze swept over her not with ownership, but with something closer to awe, quickly shuddered behind duty. He ascended the steps, offered his arm, and spoke in a low voice that only she could hear. You look formidable. She allowed a tiny smile. I thought you preferred suitable. For a heartbeat, amusement ghosted across his lips. Tonight, he murmured, I prefer formidable. And together, they descended the staircase as the orchestra swelled. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not all approving, but all watching. The Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne, side by side. The first hour passed in a blur of polite conversations and carefully measured waltzes. Nathaniel fulfilled his role with military precision, greeting peers, introducing Amara when required. Some bowed with genuine respect, others with thinly veiled curiosity. Amara responded with grace sharpened into steel. It was during the third dance that the first tremor struck. Lord Hawthorne, a portly, wine-flushed man with too much arrogance and too little sense, approached Amara during a break in the music. His wife was nowhere in sight. He bowed low, the gesture more mockery than courtesy. Your Grace, he slurred slightly. I must say, the Duke's taste is far more exotic than I'd have credited. The nearby group tittered. Amara's smile didn't waver. And your manners, she replied sweetly, are far less refined than your tailor's work. Ah, pity. Several guests stifled laughter. Hawthorne flushed. I meant no disrespect, he muttered, though the smirk on his lips betrayed him. Merely observation. Not all in this room understand the Duke's decisions. Then perhaps, Nathaniel's voice cut through like a blade, they should learn when their tongues would be better bitten. The crowd parted as he approached, his presence like a sudden gust of winter air. His gray eyes locked onto Hawthorne's, cold and unrelenting. You will apologize to the Duchess, he said. It wasn't a request. Hawthorne blustered. Your Grace, I now. The man paled. Forgive me, Your Grace. He mumbled to Amara, bowing awkwardly before scuttling away like a chastened child. For a moment, the ballroom held its breath. Then conversation resumed, louder than before, a cover for what everyone had just witnessed. Nathaniel turned to her. "I won't have them insult you." Her heart thudded. "You defended me. I defended my wife," he said firmly. Something inside her shifted. It wasn't the public defense, it was the way he said it. No calculation. No detachment. Just truth. But the night wasn't done testing them. Halfway through the evening, a footman hurried into the ballroom, pale and whispering urgently into Nathaniel's ear. His face tightened, the mask slipping into something darker. He leaned toward her. "Stay here," he ordered quietly, before disappearing through a side door with his steward. Minutes ticked by. Then a murmur began at the far end of the hall. Two men had entered, gentlemen of lesser title, but loud tongues. One carried a folded sheet of parchment, which he waved theatrically. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice oily with malice, "it appears a letter has circulated regarding the true origins of the new Duchess." A cold silence fell. Amara's stomach knotted. The man continued, relishing the attention. "It claims that her late father was not the respected diplomat he seemed, but a man of questionable alliances abroad. That's she enough." Nathaniel's voice boomed from the doorway. He strode forward, eyes blazing, the letter snatched from the man's hand before anyone could react. He scanned it quickly, then tore it in half, then again, then into shreds that fluttered to the floor like snow. "This is slander," he said to the room, each word a hammer. "Cowardly, baseless. And any person repeating it will answer to me." No one moved. No one dared. Then, unexpectedly, he turned not to the crowd but to her. "She stands here as my Duchess," he declared, his voice carrying through the hall, "and she will be treated with the respect that title demands." It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't diplomatic. It was raw, unguarded, and for the first time, society saw not just the cold Duke and the outsider Duchess, but something dangerously real between them. Amara met his gaze, her throat tight. In that moment, under the relentless gaze of London's elite, their careful arrangement cracked further, not from scandal, but from the force of his defense. Later, as the last guests departed, and the house grew quiet, Amara found Nathaniel in the corridor outside the ballroom. "Who sent that letter?" she asked softly. He exhaled slowly. "Family. Enemies. Both. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it will not touch you." She stepped closer, close enough to see the strain beneath his controlled exterior. "Nathaniel." Her voice, using his name, caught him off guard again. He looked at her, really looked, and for once, he didn't turn away. The ball had begun as a performance. It ended with a battle fought side by side. And something between them, though unnamed, had shifted forever. Ashbourne Hall lay cloaked in midnight silence. The last traces of the ball, wilted roses, half-melted candles, scattered champagne glasses rested like the remnants of a storm. The guests were gone. The whispers would spread by morning. But in the quiet hours after, something far more intimate was brewing within the walls. Amara stood alone on the terrace outside the ballroom, the night air cool against her flushed skin. She had changed out of her golden gown and into a simple ivory robe, her hair loose, cascading in dark waves over her shoulders. Above, the stars were faint, veiled by thin mist. Her hands rested on the balustrade, the stone cool under her fingers. Behind her, a door opened. Footsteps measured, deliberate, crossed the marble. Nathaniel. He appeared beside her, his cravat undone, his jacket abandoned somewhere along the way. He looked less like the Duke and more like a man at the end of a long, brutal performance. "You should be resting," he said, his voice low. She didn't turn. "So should you." He exhaled through his nose. "I doubt either of us will sleep tonight." Silence stretched between them, not cold this time, but dense, heavy with everything left unsaid. She finally turned to him. "Why did you do it?" His brow furrowed. "Do what?" "Defend me." So fiercely. "You could have ignored that letter, laughed it off, let the crowd do their damage. But you didn't. You tore it apart in front of everyone. You looked at them as if anyone who spoke against me would not leave Ashbourne alive." His jaw worked, as if he didn't quite have the language for what had happened. "Because they were wrong," he said finally. Her breath caught. "You believe me then?" I don't need to believe or not believe, he replied. I know who you are. I've watched you walk into rooms where every eye was sharpened against you and never flinch. I've seen you stare down men who would rather see you broken than standing. And you stood. He paused, voice tightening. And because you are my wife. And I'll be damned before I let this house, this title, or those vultures tear you apart. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears. She had expected indifference, maybe courtesy, but not this. Nathaniel, she whispered. He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking, until the warmth of his body mingled with the chill of the night. His eyes, those cold, guarded eyes, were different now, less fortress. More window. I married you for duty, he said quietly. I told myself I wouldn't make the mistakes my father made, that feelings would ruin everything. I thought if I built the walls high enough, nothing could reach me. And now, she asked. He gave a small, almost broken laugh. Now I find myself looking for you in every room, hearing your voice long after you've left. I catch myself wanting to tell you things I've buried for years, and that terrifies me. She didn't move away. Why? Because if I let you in, he said, his voice roughening, you could destroy me, the way love destroyed everything in this house before. She lifted her hand slowly, hesitating just a moment before resting it against his cheek. His breath hitched. I'm not your father's love story, she said softly, and you're not the boy left in the ruins. We are something new, something they can't define. The walls he'd built, those intricate, cold defenses, shuddered under the weight of her words. His hand rose, covering hers, pressing it to his face as if anchoring himself. Amara, he whispered, her name breaking like a confession. And then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered his forehead to hers. No grand gesture, no sweeping romance. Just two people standing in the dark, the distance between their souls finally narrowing. The night held its breath. Later, they sat together in the library, a single candle burning low. She leaned back in the armchair, bare feet tucked beneath her. He sat across from her, jacket discarded, waistcoat unbuttoned, the image of a man stripped of armor. He told her about his mother, how she died suddenly, when he was 14, how his father had turned the house into a place of duty and silence, how he'd learned that emotions were liabilities, that affection made people weak. She told him about her father's death overseas, the way London's polite society had frozen her out, how she had built a life out of intellect and stubbornness. They talked until the candle guttered. Somewhere between confession and silence, something irrevocable shifted. Nathaniel didn't kiss her. Not yet. But when he rose to leave, he reached for her hand. And instead of a duke's formal gesture, he brought it slowly to his lips, pressing the faintest kiss against her skin. Her breath caught not from the gesture itself, but from the softness in his eyes afterward. The fortress had cracked, and through it, something fragile and fierce had begun to grow. Spring came early to Ashbourne. The endless gray of winter melted into soft rains, coaxing blossoms from the stubborn soil. The forgotten rose garden, once wild and silent, now stood alive again under Amara's steady hands. Vines wound themselves around trellises, buds opened like secrets, and colors spilled across the grounds in defiant beauty. It had become her space, and slowly it was becoming theirs. Society had not fallen silent after the scandal at the ball. Letters circulated, whispers followed her carriage, and invitations were offered with cautious politeness. But something had changed in the weeks that followed. Nathaniel no longer stood at a distance. He walked beside her. He sat with her at dinner, no longer out of duty, but out of choice. And sometimes when they were alone, his laugh filled the corridors like sunlight in a place that had known only shadows. On the morning of the spring charity fair, the hall buzzed with preparations. This event was the social gathering of the seasoned nobles, merchants, politicians, and aristocrats converging on London's Grand Square to parade their wealth beneath the pretense of generosity. Amara's presence had been requested. No, demanded. She was the Duchess now. Every eye would be upon her. Martha fussed over her gown, a breathtaking creation of ivory silk with embroidered gold vines climbing the hem. A modest diamond necklace caught the light at her collarbone. Her hair was arranged in intricate braids woven with pearl pins. She looked radiant, but beneath it, her stomach twisted with the weight of expectation. Nathaniel entered her chambers just as the final pearl was pinned. He paused at the threshold, caught off guard by the sight of her. "You look," He stopped himself, but the rest was clear in his gaze. She met his eyes in the mirror. Like a duchess? He stepped closer. Like yourself, he said simply. She smiled faintly. And you ever the Duke? Polished armor intact, but he shook his head. Not armor, he murmured. Not with you. For a heartbeat, the air between them thickened, soft but charged. Then he offered his arm. Shall we? The fair was a spectacle of color and noise. Market stalls were dressed like ballrooms, tents housed orchestras, and ladies paraded in pastels like flocks of exotic birds. As their carriage rolled in, conversations paused. Heads turned. The Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne had arrived. Nathaniel stepped down first, then turned to offer his hand. She placed hers in his, descending slowly, aware of the hundreds of gazes fixed upon them. And then, something happened that would ripple through every drawing room in London by nightfall. Nathaniel didn't simply escort her forward. He lifted her hand right there, before the assembled nobles, and pressed his lips against it. It wasn't perfunctory. It wasn't distant. It was slow. Deliberate. The kind of gesture reserved for something precious. A stunned silence fell. Fans fluttered. Gasps broke like tiny waves. Somewhere, Lord Hawthorne nearly dropped his champagne. Amara's heart thundered. She had expected quiet support, a united front, not this. When he lowered her hand, he didn't step away. He kept her close, his arm resting lightly against hers as they moved through the crowd together. He greeted his peers not with the brittle pride of a man defending his decision, but with the calm certainty of a man who had chosen and was no longer afraid to show it. The day passed in a blur of speeches, donations, and endless small talk, but the tone had shifted. Where once there had been whispers, now there was careful respect. A duke's public gesture was no trivial matter. In that kiss, Nathaniel had rewritten the story they'd told about her. Later, as the sun dipped low and lanterns flickered to life, they found themselves away from the crowd, standing at the edge of the fairgrounds beneath the budding trees. Amara turned to him, unable to contain the question. Why? He knew what she meant. Because they needed to see what I already knew, he said simply. That I didn't marry you to appease anyone. I married you because without you, this life would remain a cold house of stone. Her throat tightened. And with me? His hand found hers again. With you, it breathes. He stepped closer, and this time, there were no hesitant pauses. He lifted her chin gently and kissed her. Soft, sure, not the kiss of a contract fulfilled, but of a heart finally unburdened. The crowd was distant, their carriages clattering away. Lantern lights swayed above them, and beneath that quiet canopy, the fortress finally fell not with noise, but with the quiet certainty of two souls who had found their way through duty, defiance, and love. Ashbourne Hall changed after that day. The staff began tending the gardens again. Laughter returned to the halls. Invitations arrived not with suspicion but with respect. Society had accepted her, but more importantly, he had. And on quiet evenings, when the sun bled gold over the rose garden, Nathaniel and Amara walked together, fingers intertwined, as if they had always belonged. He had once told her she was not fit to be a wife. Now he couldn't imagine his life without her.